The children start dying on a Tuesday. No fever, no plague, no wound anyone can find. They simply convulse, scream about invisible hands squeezing their throats, and point at an old woman who lives at the edge of the forest. Her name is Tituba, and within 6 months, she will help destroy an entire community from the inside out. It's 1692. Salem Village, Massachusetts, a tight-knit Puritan settlement of roughly 600 people clinging to existence in a land that still feels foreign and hostile. Winter is brutal here. Harvests fail without warning. Neighbors dispute property lines with a bitterness that curdles into something uglier over the years. And into this pressure cooker steps a slave woman from Barbados, property of Reverend Samuel Parris, doing her best to survive in a world that has given her absolutely nothing. No rights, no freedom, no name beyond the one her enslaver assigned her. When Parris's daughter Betty and her cousin Abigail Williams begin having fits, screaming, contorting, babbling nonsense, the community needs an answer. And Tituba, the outsider, the dark-skinned woman who told the children stories of Caribbean folklore, is the answer they choose. Under brutal interrogation, possibly torture, she does something unexpected. She confesses, not just to witchcraft, but to a vivid, detailed conspiracy of witches riding through the night, signing the Devil's Book, a red cat, a tall man from Boston. She names names. She gives them a story. That confession saved her life, for now. But here's what's almost never discussed when people retell this story. The fits don't start in a vacuum. 2 families had been locked in a property dispute for years before 1692, the Porters and the Putnams. Anne Putnam Sr., whose daughter would become one of the most prolific accusers in the trials, was deeply connected to that conflict. Of the 19 people eventually hanged on Gallows Hill, a striking number owned land that neighboring families had contested claims to, land that, after execution, became available. The first formal accusation after Tituba targets Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, both women marginalized, both without male protectors, both without the social capital to fight back. Sarah Good was a homeless beggar. Sarah Osborne hadn't attended church in over a year and had the audacity to try to control her own inheritance. These were not random victims. These were women the community had already decided it didn't want. Then something happened that made everything worse. The accusations stopped being small. They metastasized. By May 1692, a special court called the Court of Oyer and Terminer had been established, and it operated on a legal framework that was, put plainly, insane. Spectral evidence was admissible. This meant that if you testified you saw someone's spirit attacking you in a dream, that was enough to condemn them. You couldn't disprove a dream. The accused had no real avenue of defense, and the accused who confessed and named others, they lived. The ones who maintained their innocence, they hanged. 150 people were jailed. 19 were executed. One man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death under heavy stones for refusing to enter a plea, because entering a plea would have allowed the court to seize his estate. His last words, reportedly, were, "More weight." He died protecting his children's inheritance. Here's what they don't tell you in the sanitized version. This crisis generated enormous revenue for the court system. Prisoners were charged for their own imprisonment, for their food, their chains, their jail cell. If you were acquitted, you were still held until you paid your fees. Some exonerated people sat in prison for months because they couldn't afford the bill for their own wrongful imprisonment. Tituba herself, despite her confession and cooperation, remained jailed because Reverend Parris refused to pay her prison fees. He eventually sold her, to an unknown buyer to cover the cost. The woman whose testimony ignited the entire catastrophe disappeared into the historical record, her name becoming a shorthand for a story that was never really about her. By October 1692, Governor William Phips had seen enough. His own wife had been accused. He dissolved the court. The madness ended almost as suddenly as it began. This isn't just history. What happened in Salem is a nearly perfect blueprint for what happens when fear becomes an industry, when accusations carry social reward, when the system incentivizes denunciation over truth. We'd love to believe this is a relic, something that died on Gallows Hill, but the architecture of Salem appears in every era. McCarthyism, the satanic panic of the 1980s, when hundreds of daycare workers were prosecuted for abuse that forensic evidence consistently failed to support. Modern social media pylons where a single accusation, regardless of evidence, can erase a career, a livelihood, a life. The accused must prove a negative. The accusers are protected. The institutions profit from the chaos. In 2022, the Massachusetts legislature formally exonerated Elizabeth Johnson, Jr., the last remaining Salem accused who had not been cleared. She was 19 years old in 1692. She had no descendants to advocate for her over the centuries. She waited 329 years for her name to be restored. Think about that. 329 years. The real demon in Salem wasn't Tituba. It wasn't even the teenage girls whose motivations historians still debate. The real demon was a system that turned fear into a legal mechanism, property into a motive, and justice into a transaction. Tituba didn't curse Salem. Salem cursed itself, and then handed the bill to the people who could least afford to pay it. We tell this story as a cautionary tale about superstition, but it's actually a story about what happens when institutions are rewarded for finding guilt rather than truth, when the cost of accusation is zero and the cost of defense is everything, when the community's anxiety needs a vessel and the vessel is always someone without power. So here's the question worth sitting with. What institutions today are running the same system? Where is spectral evidence still admissible, not in law, but in culture? Who is being pressed under more weight right now? And what inheritance are they dying to protect? If stories like this one make you see the present differently, you know where to be. Subscribe, and let's keep pulling the thread.